It started like any other quiet morning in the small neighborhood. The sun had just risen, spilling soft golden light over the neatly lined houses, each with its own little garden and mailbox. The air smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass and flowers that had survived the recent cold snap. For the family in the corner house, mornings were calm. The parent moved quietly around the kitchen, preparing breakfast while their teenage son shuffled in with a sleepy yawn and a mug of hot chocolate. It was a simple routine, the kind that most people in the neighborhood barely noticed, but for this family, it was a small treasure, a moment of peace before the world demanded attention. The parent had moved to this neighborhood a few years ago, hoping for a safe and friendly place for themselves and their son. It had seemed perfect at first. Neighbors waved when passing by, kids played in the streets without fear, and the community seemed to share a sense of quiet respect for one another. They had always followed the rules, never causing trouble, and kept the house in order. The lawn was mowed, trash was taken out on time, and mailboxes were always neat. They wanted nothing more than to live quietly and raise their child in a safe, stable environment. But then she appeared, the HOA president. Known around the neighborhood for her strict attitude and obsession with rules, she had a reputation that made people uncomfortable. Many neighbors tiptoed around her, trying not to attract her attention. She had a way of appearing at the wrong place at the wrong time, armed with clipboards, cameras, and a voice that carried far more authority than most thought was reasonable for a community volunteer. At first, the family didn't have any interactions with her. They thought maybe if they kept a low profile, she would leave them alone. That was a mistake. It started with small, almost invisible actions. A note left on the parents' mailbox one morning, complaining about the angle of the garden hose or the color of the welcome mat. At first, it seemed silly. The parent laughed about it with their son over breakfast, thinking someone must have mistaken their house for another. But soon, these notes became more frequent. Complaints about the lawn being too tall, even though it had been mowed just the day before. Comments about the way the curtains were hung, or the slight tilt of the mailbox. It was relentless, and each note seemed to carry a growing sense of judgment and anger. The son noticed it too. He was quiet by nature, observant and patient, but even he could feel the tension creeping into the mornings. He tried to ignore it at first, telling himself that adults often overreact, and that people like this were just part of the world. But he could see it in his parents' eyes, the slow, creeping frustration and worry that this small, unnecessary conflict was starting to create. It was one thing to follow rules, it was another to constantly be made to feel like they were never enough. Then came the first verbal confrontation. The HOA president showed up unannounced, standing on the sidewalk with her clipboard. Her expression a mixture of anger and superiority. She began listing the family's alleged violations in a sharp, clipped voice, pointing at things that had never been issues before. The parent listened patiently, trying to remain calm, but inside, a storm was brewing. The son stood behind the door, gripping the frame, wanting to say something, but unsure what. The confrontation ended with a threat of fines if the problems were not corrected immediately. She walked away, leaving a sense of fear and confusion lingering in the air, like smoke from a fire that hadn't yet started. Days passed and the harassment became more visible. The HOA president was now showing up at times when she knew the family would be home. She watched from the street, taking notes and photos, waiting for the next mistake. Other neighbors began to notice, some offering sympathetic smiles, others turning away, unwilling to get involved. The parent tried to keep life normal, going to work, making meals, helping their son with school. But the constant pressure began to wear on them. Every minor noise from the street made them tense. Every shadow through the window made them jump. The home, once a place of comfort, felt like a trap. The son, though, began to observe more than ever. He noticed the way the HOA president moved, the patterns in her visits, the way she seemed to relish pointing out flaws that weren't really there. He listened to the parents' quiet sighs in the evening, saw the way their shoulders slumped under the weight of constant scrutiny. And quietly, he started thinking. He wasn't sure yet what he could do, but he knew something needed to change. This wasn't just about rules or complaints. It was about respect. about standing up to someone who thought they could control lives with a clipboard, a sharp tongue. It wasn't long before the first public incident occurred. During a weekend gathering at the community park, the parent had taken the son for a quick walk. The HOA president, as if sensing an opportunity, arrived at the same time. She began loudly criticizing the parent for illegal decorations in the yard, pointing fingers and raising her voice so that nearby neighbors could hear. People began whispering, and the parent felt a mix of embarrassment and anger. The son, usually quiet, stood closer, his mind racing. He noticed the looks on neighbors' faces, some sympathetic, some uneasy, some clearly judging without knowing the full story. The parent tried to stay composed, explaining calmly that everything was within the rules. But the HOA president would not relent. She stormed off finally, leaving a trail of tension that followed them home. That evening, at the dinner table, the parent tried to make light of the situation. Maybe she just needs a hobby, they said with a weak laugh. But the son could tell the parent wasn't joking. He could feel the worry in the way they moved, the quiet sadness when they thought no one was watching. He started paying closer attention to the HOA president's actions, noting every detail, every inconsistency, every moment of overreach. He began imagining ways to respond not with anger, but with cleverness, with strategy. If his parent couldn't solve this, maybe he could. Over the next few weeks, the pattern continued. Notes, photographs, sudden appearances, false accusations. The parent followed all the rules, tried to stay calm, and even spoke to the HOA board formally to explain themselves. Nothing worked. The HOA president seemed to thrive on the tension, taking small, innocuous actions and twisting them into accusations. It was exhausting. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, some offering vague support, others avoiding the family entirely. The parent began to feel isolated, trapped in a system that didn't seem fair. And the son watched, learning quietly, thinking carefully, waiting for the right moment to make a move. Even inside the house, the tension was tangible. Every knock on the door, every sound from outside made the parent flinch. The son would watch them, feeling both protective and frustrated. He knew that getting angry wouldn't solve anything. That would only give the HOA president what she wanted. Instead, he started keeping careful notes, remembering dates, photographing the minor violations, and documenting each encounter. It was his way of turning fear into preparation, of slowly gathering pieces of a puzzle that no one else seemed to see yet. In the quiet moments, the son would sit at his desk, sometimes late at night, reviewing his notes and thinking through possibilities. He imagined ways to confront the HOA president with evidence, ways to reveal the truth without breaking rules or laws. He began to understand the power of patience, the importance of strategy, and the strength of quiet observation. What had begun as simple annoyance was slowly becoming a mission, not just for the parent's peace of mind, but for the family's dignity. The tension reached a small climax one evening when a letter arrived, threatening fines that were absurdly high for minor issues that didn't exist. The parents stared at it in disbelief, their hands shaking slightly. The son picked it up, reading through the lines carefully. His mind raced. He realized that this was not just a personal attack, it was a pattern, a strategy to intimidate. And that's when he made a decision. He would not let this continue. But he would not act rashly. Instead, he would plan, gather, and prepare, knowing that the right moment would come when the truth could be revealed, and the family could finally be free from harassment by the end of that week. The parent and son sat together in the living room, the tension in the air heavy but familiar. They spoke quietly, carefully choosing words, sharing thoughts without revealing too much. The parents still did not know the son's plan, but they trusted him, as parents do. And the son felt a quiet determination, a sense of purpose that went beyond frustration. He knew this neighborhood had rules meant to maintain peace, but there were also people who abused them, and he would find a way to expose that, not with anger, but with truth. And so, life continued in its uneasy rhythm. The sun rose and set, neighbors went about their days, and the HOA president continued her small campaigns of intimidation. But inside the house, a quiet strength was forming. The parent tried to keep life normal, maintaining routines, staying positive, and protecting their child. And the son, though quiet and unassuming, was preparing for something that would change everything. What started as small annoyances had begun to grow into a test of patience, intelligence, and courage, and no one in the neighborhood, not even the overbearing HOA president, yet realized that the son had noticed everything, and that a quiet storm was slowly gathering strength, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. The days following the arrival of the threatening letter became even harder for the family. Each morning began with a quiet dread, a silent question of what new complaint or note might appear on the doorstep. The parent tried their best to keep the house calm, maintaining the usual routines. Breakfast was still made, dishes washed, laundry folded, and homework checked. But underneath the surface, there was tension, like a low hum that never left the walls. It was impossible to ignore. The son noticed the change immediately. He could see it in the parents' hands, trembling slightly as they held the coffee mug, and in the way their eyes darted to the mailbox at every sound outside. He knew they were trying to stay composed, but the strain was obvious. The father or mother figure, usually steady and calm, now flinched at the smallest disturbance, and he felt a growing responsibility to protect them. Even if it meant being patient and quiet for now, it wasn't long before the HOA president escalated her tactics. One afternoon, as the parent worked in the garden, she appeared in her usual fashion, clipboard in hand, a stern expression painted across her face. She began to point out imagined violations, raising her voice in a way that drew the attention of the neighbors. "Your hedges are too high," she said sharply, though they had been trimmed just the day before, "and your walkway has cracks that are unsafe." The parent tried to explain calmly that everything was in order, but she didn't want to listen. Her voice grew louder, more insulting, and it wasn't long before neighbors gathered, some watching with curiosity, others whispering to each other. The son stood silently beside the parent, feeling a mix of anger and determination. He could see how embarrassed the parent felt, how each word from the HOA president struck like a small blow. But he also noticed the mistakes the woman was making. She was so focused on intimidation that she didn't notice her own errors. Photos she took were at odd angles, dates in her notes didn't match. And in her rush to appear authoritative, she made statements that could be easily challenged if anyone paid attention. The son made a mental note of everything, snapping photos on his phone without making it obvious. After she left, the parent sank onto the porch steps, running hands through tired hair. The son sat down beside them, offering silent support. He didn't speak at first, knowing words couldn't erase the humiliation. But he did say, "We can deal with this. We just need to be smart about it." The parent gave a small smile, the kind that tries to hide worry, and nodded. They trusted the son's calm demeanor, even though they didn't yet understand the full extent of what he was planning. Over the next week, the HOA president's actions became increasingly unpredictable. One morning, the family woke to find a new sign posted in their yard, a bright, official-looking notice declaring a violation of landscaping rules. It was completely fabricated. The son quickly took a picture and kept it as evidence. At school, he began jotting down observations in a notebook, noting the patterns of her visits, the exaggerations she made, and the moments when she overstepped boundaries. He knew that patience and preparation were going to be the keys to handling this situation. The parent, meanwhile, was growing more cautious. They avoided unnecessary interactions, stopped greeting the HOA president, and tried to ignore the snide remarks of neighbors who had started taking sides without knowing the full story. The stress was heavy, and sometimes it spilled over in quiet sighs or moments of frustration. But the son's quiet presence reminded them that they weren't alone. He watched, he remembered, and he began to build a mental strategy for confronting the unfair treatment in a way that would protect them both. One evening, as they prepared dinner, there was a knock at the door. The parent froze for a moment, heart sinking, as the HOA president's familiar figure appeared again. This time, she claimed she had received complaints from other neighbors about the family's fence, saying it was too short and violated community guidelines. The parent calmly explained the fence had been approved years earlier, with no changes made. But she wasn't listening. Her voice rose, and she began questioning them in front of the son, who stayed silent, observing every detail. He noticed inconsistencies in her story, contradictions between her claims and official documents, and subtle ways in which she revealed her own misunderstanding of the rules as she left. Still muttering threats, the son turned to the parent. "I'm going to make sure this stops," he said quietly. The parent looked at him, worry and admiration mixing in their expression. They had always known their child was smart, but this quiet determination was new, a sign that the son was preparing for something important. They nodded, understanding without words that he would handle this carefully. Without causing more conflict, the harassment wasn't limited to physical visits. The HOA president began sending emails late at night, complaining about every minor detail she could imagine. Paint colors, garden decorations, even the way the mail was organized, were suddenly violations. Each email was crafted to provoke fear and anxiety. The parent read them with a tight jaw, feeling a mix of frustration and helplessness. But the son remained calm. He read each message carefully, screenshotting and archiving them, noting the exaggerations and outright lies. While the parent felt trapped, the son was quietly building the evidence that would eventually turn the situation around. One weekend, a neighborhood meeting was scheduled to address community issues. The parent was hesitant to attend, knowing the HOA president would likely make a scene. But the son insisted. "We can't hide forever. We have to be ready when the time comes," he said. The parent reluctantly agreed. At the meeting, the HOA president immediately took the floor, pointing fingers and loudly criticizing the family. She listed alleged violations with an air of authority, exaggerating and even fabricating details to make them appear worse. The parent tried to respond calmly, providing explanations and facts. But the HOA president shouted over them, dismissing their words. Some neighbors seemed to believe her without question, while others watched quietly, unsure what to think. The son observed everything, noting who might be sympathetic, who might be swayed, and how the president's own statements could be challenged with careful documentation. By the end of the meeting, the family felt exhausted, but the son left with a sense of clarity. He knew what needed to be done and how to prepare. Back at home, the parent poured a cup of tea, finally letting out a long sigh. "I don't know how much longer we can handle this," they admitted softly. The son placed a hand on their shoulder. "We'll handle it. We just have to wait for the right moment. Patience," he said. There was something in his voice, calm and unwavering, that reassured the parent. They didn't fully understand how he could be so composed, but they trusted him completely. In the evenings, the son began spending more time at the computer, organizing evidence, creating folders of screenshots, notes, and photos. Each minor violation, each unjust threat, was documented carefully. He even cross-checked HOA rules, ensuring he could prove when the president's accusations were false. While the parent rested or tried to unwind with a book, the son was quietly preparing for a confrontation that would eventually expose the unfair treatment they were enduring. As the days passed, the HOA president's actions became increasingly erratic. She began showing up at odd hours, taking photos of areas that had never been mentioned before, and posting notices that contradicted previous rules. Neighbors whispered about her behavior, some expressing sympathy, some quietly mocking her obsession with control. The parent grew more anxious, but the son remained focused, always observing, always calculating. He knew that reacting in anger would only play into her hands. Instead, he stayed calm, letting her frustration grow while he quietly gathered the tools they would need for justice. One afternoon, the son noticed something important. While reviewing photos and emails, he realized there were clear patterns in the president's complaints. She targeted times when the parent was busy at work or distracted, relied on vague rules that were open to interpretation, often misrepresented facts to create fear. The son smiled quietly to himself. The pattern was clear. If he played his cards correctly, the HOA president's arrogance and carelessness would be her undoing. That evening, over dinner, the parent asked cautiously, "Do you really think we can fix this?" The son nodded. "We can. We just need to be ready. She's making mistakes and we're noticing them. One day, everyone will see the truth. The parent felt a spark of hope they hadn't felt in months. Even though the harassment continued, there was now a sense of purpose, a plan forming in the background that offered a glimmer of relief. Weeks passed, and the family continued to live under the watchful eye of the HOA president. But something had changed. The parent was still wary, still cautious, but they were no longer alone in the struggle. The son had become a silent protector, analyzing, documenting, and preparing. They knew that the harassment could continue for a while, but with careful planning and patient observation. They had begun to shift the balance of power. The tension in the neighborhood grew. Other families noticed the conflicts, some quietly taking sides, others staying distant. But the son's quiet vigilance meant that the family was no longer powerless. Each encounter, each email, each note, and each public confrontation was now part of a larger puzzle. Every mistake the HOA president made was a piece of evidence that could be used to expose the truth. And the son, patient and meticulous, was ready to assemble the pieces at the right moment. By the end of part 2, the situation had escalated, but the family was no longer helpless. The parent continued their routines, trying to maintain calm and normalcy, while the son quietly documented every action, studied patterns, and prepared a strategy. The stage was set for the next phase, where the HOA president's arrogance and the son's careful planning would collide, leading toward a revelation that no one in the neighborhood could ignore. Life had settled into a tense rhythm. Every morning began with the quiet dread of seeing what new complaint or note might have appeared overnight. The parent tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but it was clear the harassment from the HOA president was escalating. Yet while the parent struggled with frustration and exhaustion, the son had begun to quietly take matters into his own hands. It started with small, almost invisible actions. The son began researching the HOA rules in detail, reading every clause, every guideline, and every fine print that could be relevant. What had once seemed like dull reading suddenly became a tool for understanding the system that had been used against them. He cross-referenced each accusation the president had made with official documentation, noting contradictions and gaps in her claims. Every violation she had mentioned was carefully analyzed, and he began to realize how vulnerable she had made herself by acting carelessly at first. He worked quietly at the desk in his room, not wanting to alarm the parent. He made lists, kept folders, and created charts showing patterns in her harassment. He noticed that she often visited at predictable times, usually when the parent was busy at work or distracted, that she exaggerated minor issues in ways that could easily be disproved with proper evidence. Each discovery gave him a small sense of power, a way to fight back without confronting her directly. He didn't stop there. The son also began observing her interactions with other neighbors. He noted who seemed to support her, who avoided involvement, and who was quietly skeptical of her claims. He realized that the more evidence he could gather, the more he could protect the family and expose the pattern of intimidation she relied upon. Slowly, a plan began to form in his mind, not a reckless plan, but a careful, patient strategy that could change everything when the time was right. Meanwhile, the parent continued to deal with the daily stress of harassment. One afternoon, while trimming the hedges, the HOA president appeared yet again. She had a clipboard in hand, a frown on her face, and an air of authority that had become all too familiar. She pointed out a small patch of weeds near the fence, claiming it was out of compliance and threatening a fine. The parent explained calmly that they were aware and that it would be taken care of, but she wasn't satisfied. Her tone became sharper, louder, and more aggressive. Drawing the attention of neighbors passing by, the son watched from the porch, notebook in hand. He didn't intervene, but he observed every gesture, every word, every inconsistency in her claims. He noted the timing, the exaggerations, and the mistakes she made in describing community rules. He began thinking about how he could use this information to turn the tables. He realized that while the parent was exhausted and stressed, he had the advantage of clarity, patience, and preparation. The harassment, he thought, could be turned into proof of her overreach if handled correctly. Over the next few days, the son increased his documentation. He set up a schedule to photograph the yard at different times, record notes on when she visited, and organize emails and letters in chronological order. He even began compiling records of her communications with other neighbors, noting contradictions and instances of intimidation. Each piece of evidence was carefully labeled and stored, a puzzle slowly taking shape in his mind. The parent noticed the change in him, but didn't fully understand. One evening, over dinner, they commented, "You seem so focused these days. Are you planning something?" The son smiled faintly. "I'm just making sure we're ready. She can't keep treating us unfairly forever. We just need to be prepared." The parent nodded, feeling a mix of relief and curiosity. They trusted him, but even they couldn't have imagined the depth of his preparation. The son also began to anticipate the HOA president's tactics. He noticed that she thrived on public attention, using moments when others were around to exaggerate and intimidate. He started thinking about how those moments could be used to reveal the truth instead. He envisioned situations where her own actions would expose her mistakes, where her exaggerations and threats would backfire in front of the community. Every visit, every email, every note was now not just harassment, but material for a careful plan. At school, the son quietly discussed his thoughts with a close friend, careful not to reveal details that could compromise their strategy. He spoke about fairness, about standing up to people who abuse authority, and about the importance of evidence and patience. His friend listened, impressed by the thoughtfulness and maturity behind his approach. It was clear that this wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, measured, and strategic. Back home, the parent continued to deal with the direct impact of the HOA president's behavior. One afternoon, while the parent was watering flowers, she appeared at the gate again. This time, she demanded to see documentation, proving that certain repairs had been done to the fence, even though the fence had been inspected and approved years earlier. The parent calmly explained the history, but she continued her barrage, raising her voice and gesturing aggressively. Neighbors passing by paused, some whispering, some watching silently. The son stood nearby, silently recording everything. He took photos of the clipboard, noted the time, and wrote down exact quotes. He began to realize that the president was creating a paper trail that could be disproved, and that with enough preparation, it could all be used against her. He felt a sense of control he hadn't felt in months. For the first time, he saw a way to protect his parent and restore fairness. And he began to plan how to assemble all the evidence in a way that would leave no room for doubt. Over the next week, the son worked tirelessly. He reviewed every communication, every photo, every note. He created a detailed timeline of events, showing the pattern of harassment, exaggeration, and intimidation. He cross-referenced community rules with her complaints, highlighting contradictions and inconsistencies. He even prepared a folder showing how other neighbors had experienced similar treatment, carefully documenting each case. It was a meticulous process, but he understood that patience and preparation were crucial. The parent noticed the growing organization, but said nothing. They were exhausted, but a sense of hope began to creep in, quiet but persistent. The son's determination reminded them that they weren't powerless, that there was a way to handle the harassment without escalating conflict or losing control. For the first time in weeks, they felt a small spark of optimism. The son also began to think about timing. He knew that confronting the HOA president too early could backfire. He needed a moment when the evidence was undeniable, when the pattern of harassment was clear, and when the community could see the truth. He envisioned the perfect moment, a public setting where her arrogance would be exposed, her mistakes revealed, and the family's reputation restored. Every email, every photo, every note, every inconsistency was part of the puzzle, waiting for the right time to come together. Evenings became a quiet but productive routine. The parent would sit and try to relax, sometimes reading a book or sipping tea, while the son worked on compiling evidence and reviewing the timeline of events. The house, once tense and fearful, began to feel like a place of quiet planning, where patience and preparation created strength. The son understood that this was more than just a fight over rules. It was a battle for fairness, dignity, and respect. Neighbors began to notice subtle changes too. The son would sometimes answer questions about minor complaints calmly, without showing frustration, while the parent remained composed despite the constant harassment. People began to see that the family was not weak, that they were thoughtful and careful, even under pressure. The HOA president, meanwhile, continued her aggressive tactics, unaware that her actions were being documented and analyzed, and that the family was quietly preparing for a decisive response. One afternoon, the son noticed another opportunity. The HOA president had made yet another public accusation, exaggerating minor details during a neighborhood event. This time, the son recorded everything carefully, noting contradictions in her statements and capturing evidence that could clearly prove her exaggerations. He realized that with each overreach, she was unintentionally building the case against herself. The more aggressive she became, the stronger the evidence became for the family. Over time, the son's careful preparation became a quiet strength for the parent. They began to feel less powerless, knowing that someone was carefully observing, documenting, and planning. The parent still faced direct harassment, but the knowledge that a thoughtful, deliberate plan was in motion brought a sense of relief. It was no longer just about enduring. It was about strategy, patience, and waiting for the right moment to turn the tables. By the end of this period, the son had completed what could only be described as a comprehensive record of harassment, exaggeration, and intimidation. Every visit, every email, every note, and every public confrontation had been documented, analyzed, and cross-referenced. The plan was ready to be executed when the right opportunity arose, and the family's patience, resilience, and quiet determination had created a foundation that could not be easily shaken. The parent began to sense that change was coming. They still worried about the constant presence of the HOA president. But there was now hope, a quiet confidence that someone was ready to take action. The son's preparation was meticulous, careful, and strategic, ensuring that when the time came, the family could respond in a way that was undeniable and fair. And so, the stage was set. The harassment continued, but the family was no longer powerless. Every unjust action taken by the HOA president was now a piece of evidence, waiting for the perfect moment. The son had transformed quiet observation into strength, planning into power, and patience into strategy. The next step would be crucial, the moment when preparation would meet opportunity, and the truth would finally be revealed for everyone to see. The day had arrived when everything that had been quietly planned and prepared would finally meet the moment of truth. The neighborhood had called a special meeting, a gathering meant to address recent complaints and conflicts in the community. The parent had mixed feelings, nervous, anxious, but also a quiet hope that change could finally come. Their son, however, was calm, composed, and ready. He had spent weeks meticulously documenting every encounter, every email, every note, and every exaggeration the HOA president had made. Today, all that preparation would finally be used. The community center was buzzing with people as families arrived. Some curious, some supportive, and some already leaning toward the HOA president's side. The parent and son walked in quietly, choosing seats near the back to observe. The HOA president was there too, clipboard in hand, a self-satisfied look on her face. She clearly expected to dominate the meeting, to intimidate anyone who dared speak against her. No one suspected that her own actions were about to be exposed in front of everyone. The meeting began with the usual introductions and statements. Complaints were aired, voices raised, and the HOA president was quick to jump in, pointing fingers and exaggerating every minor infraction that had been reported from her side. She seemed confident, almost arrogant, speaking as if everyone in the room would unquestioningly believe her. But the son had noticed her overconfidence long ago, and he knew it was an opportunity. When it came time for the parent to respond, they started carefully, calmly, recounting the truth in measured words. They explained that the complaints were minor, already addressed, or fabricated entirely. They spoke with a quiet strength that had been built over weeks of enduring harassment, and it caught the attention of some neighbors who had been uncertain before. But even as the parent spoke, the HOA president tried to interrupt, her voice rising and her gestures becoming more aggressive. It was clear she didn't expect resistance, and she certainly didn't expect someone to have proof. Then the son stood up. The room fell quiet. Everyone had been used to seeing him quiet and reserved, rarely speaking up in public. But now he held a folder, a collection of carefully organized evidence. He began to speak in a calm, deliberate voice, laying out a timeline of events that contradicted every exaggeration the HOA president had made. He presented photographs, notes, and email screenshots, showing exactly when she had appeared, what she had said, and how her claims did not match the facts. The HOA president's confident expression began to falter. The son continued, showing examples of her public accusations that were clearly exaggerated or outright false. He pointed out patterns in her behavior, the repeated harassment, and how she had targeted the family unfairly over weeks and months. Neighbors began whispering among themselves, some nodding, some looking shocked. The parents sat quietly, holding their breath, watching as their son methodically dismantled the false image the president had created. It became clear that the son had thought of everything. He even included records showing how other neighbors had experienced similar treatment, creating a picture of a pattern of intimidation and abuse of power. He explained each point with clarity, showing how the president's claims had no basis and how her actions had caused unnecessary stress and humiliation. The room was silent except for his voice, calm and steady, each word hitting harder than any raised voice could have. The HOA president tried to interrupt, to argue, to dismiss the evidence, but every time she spoke, the son had already anticipated her responses. He calmly referred to the documents she had provided in past emails, highlighting contradictions, inconsistencies, and exaggerations. The more she tried to assert authority, the more obvious it became to the community that her claims were unfounded. Her confidence was crumbling in real time. The room was beginning to sense it. Neighbors leaned forward, whispering to each other about the shocking clarity of the evidence. One after another, the son presented examples, timelines, and comparisons. He even showed photographs she had taken herself, angles that actually disproved her own claims. The parent could hardly believe it what had seemed impossible. To finally stand up to her intimidation was happening before their eyes. Their son had turned weeks of observation into a powerful, undeniable argument. The HOA president's face reddened as she realized that her carefully constructed image of authority was falling apart. She tried to regain control, waving her clipboard and raising her voice, but it only made her contradictions more obvious. Each claim she made was met with evidence the son had prepared, each accusation countered with facts and documents. The room was tense, but the silence spoke volumes. Neighbors who had previously been uncertain now began to see the truth, recognizing the unfair treatment the family had endured at one point. The son revealed emails where she had threatened fines that had no basis in the rules. He showed letters she had left on the family's doorstep that exaggerated minor issues into alleged violations. He even pointed out instances where her own notes contradicted previous statements, leaving no room for doubt. The parents watched in awe as their son, once quiet and reserved, had become the voice of reason, clarity, and justice. The HOA president, now visibly flustered, attempted one final outburst, accusing the family of dishonesty and rule-breaking. But the son calmly responded, holding up documents that proved every point. "These are the facts," he said. "Every accusation has been documented, and every complaint has been reviewed against the community rules. Nothing here supports your claims." His voice was steady, confident, and unwavering. The room was completely silent now, the weight of evidence undeniable. For the first time, neighbors saw the full scope of her behavior. Whispers turned into murmurs of agreement, and some began nodding in understanding. The parent felt a mix of pride and relief, realizing that the fear and tension that had plagued their home for months were finally being challenged, and that their son's quiet diligence had made it possible. They had endured, waited, and now they were witnessing the moment when truth could no longer be denied. The president, unable to find a response, finally fell silent. Her attempts to regain control failed entirely. She could no longer dominate the conversation or intimidate the family. The community, having witnessed the evidence firsthand, began asking questions, seeking clarification. and quietly siding with the family. The balance of power had shifted. What had once seemed like an unstoppable force of intimidation was now exposed as careless, exaggerated, and unfair. The parents stood and addressed the room briefly, expressing gratitude for the opportunity to present their side and emphasizing the importance of fairness and community respect. The son stayed calm, standing beside them, a quiet but powerful presence that had changed the course of the meeting. The community listened attentively, many finally seeing the truth that had been hidden behind intimidation and exaggeration. After the meeting, several neighbors approached the parent and son privately, apologizing for not speaking up earlier and expressing support. Some admitted they had been unsure, intimidated by the president's presence, or unaware of the full situation. Others thanked the son directly, amazed by his careful preparation and courage. The parent felt a deep sense of relief, realizing that the quiet storm their son had prepared had finally broken through, exposing the truth and protecting them from further harassment. The HOA president left the meeting that day in defeat. Her arrogance had been exposed, her exaggerations laid bare, her authority undermined by careful documentation and patient observation. She could no longer intimidate the family or claim credibility in front of the community. The parent and son walked home together, a sense of peace settling over them for the first time in months, the tension that had dominated their mornings. Afternoons and evenings was lifting, replaced by a quiet relief and a newfound confidence at home. The parent thanked their son quietly. "You were amazing," they said, their voice full of emotion. "I can't believe how carefully and calmly you handled everything." The son shrugged, a small smile on his face. "I just wanted to make sure it was fair." It wasn't about winning. It was about showing the truth. The parent felt a swell of pride, realizing that the months of observation, planning, and patience had paid off in the most powerful way possible. Even after the meeting, life didn't immediately return to perfect normal. The HOA president remained in the neighborhood, but her influence had diminished. She could no longer spread fear, exaggerate violations, or intimidate the family. The parent and son continued to live their lives quietly, but with a renewed sense of confidence and control. They now knew that patience, preparation, careful observation could turn even the most difficult situations around. Neighbors who had witnessed the meeting began to change their attitudes. The family was no longer seen as the subject of complaints, but as examples of perseverance, intelligence, and integrity. Others who had experienced similar issues with the president began to feel encouraged, realizing they could also stand up with evidence and calm determination. The son had not only protected his family, but also inspired a quiet shift in the community. By the end of the week, the parent reflected on the journey. The months of tension, humiliation, and stress had been difficult, but they had also revealed something extraordinary: the quiet strength and intelligence of their son. He had observed, planned, and executed a strategy that not only protected them, but restored their dignity and fairness. The parent realized that what had seemed like an impossible situation had been overcome, not with anger or confrontation, but with patience, preparation, and courage. And so, life in the neighborhood slowly began to regain balance. The HOA president's authority was weakened, her actions now closely scrutinized by neighbors. The family could finally enjoy a sense of peace, knowing that they had stood up to unfair treatment and that their voices had been heard. The son, quiet as ever, continued to observe and prepare, understanding that vigilance and careful thinking were just as important as courage and determination. The day had been long, emotional, and intense, but it ended with a profound sense of justice. The family had endured harassment, remained calm, and relied on careful planning to reveal the truth. The son had been the quiet force behind the transformation, showing that intelligence, patience, and courage could overcome even the most persistent intimidation. For the first time in months, the parent could breathe freely, and the neighborhood had witnessed the power of fairness, truth, and careful preparation.